hot. So that's all the paint, all blistered.
Did you have Navy liaison and all on this boat, or?
No,
Okay.
just Vietnamese. We'll just show you something. We'll get to the inside the ship here in just a second, I guess. All right, that was just us shooting some 50 caliber tracers. Okay, so there's the racks. All right. So this guy says, well, you want to sleep up here? And I goes, well, I don't care. So he just takes this little mattress that's there, folds it up, takes all the stuff that's underneath it. I mean, you had letters and you had clothes and you had anything. If you wanted to press your whites, you put them underneath your rack and you could flatten everything out really nice. Wadded all this stuff up in that little mattress and just took it down in between these other two rows of mattresses and just went, threw it in there. So there's your rack. All right. So a couple days later, when this guy that used to sleep there came in off of leave, and I feel this, what are you doing in my rack? I says, your rack's down over there, okay? we didn't act like that on the shore stations. It was a real family. Here it was a little different. But anyway, that's where we slept, and you can see the bags that had what they call rough dry. They just washed everything and dried it in a bag so your stuff didn't mix up with somebody else's, and that's as good as it got. But that's one of the racks, and down between there's some more. This wasn't crowded. It was crowded the deck below where the non-rates were, the E1s, 2s, and 3s. And that was kind of getting ready for inspection. So you see how much better it looked? And then this was my locker. That's maybe 2.5 feet deep. That's what we lived in. Whatever was underneath your mattress, hanging in a bag or in that locker. And if it wasn't there, well, they put it in the lucky bag, right? It was gear adrift and it just went away. And then they'd have an auction at some time. They'd store that stuff down at the laundry. And then when they had enough of it, they'd have an auction and you could buy it back. And if somebody wanted more than you do, they bought it back. All right, but that's kind of how we lived. I could not sit up in that bunk because of the pipes and the valves and everything else there. Anyway, that was my house.
How did you climb into that?
By stepping on anybody's hands that were on the railings underneath there. And they had chains on it here on the ends. There was a chain coming up for this and it went up to the overhead, and that's what held them there. And in the mornings when they got up, one of the calls was heave out and trice up. And trice up meant take that bottom rack and lift it up, and it hooked up so that you could get underneath it and sweep or polish the linoleum decks or whatever you want to do. But that was tricing up your rack, was getting it up off the floor basically, because that guy on the bottom was on the floor. Okay. Anyway, we were talking about reporting aboard, and that was the rack situation. And it was just a couple hours after breakfast that this other bosun mate came down and he said, the chief wants to see you. Well, I didn't even know where the chief was at that point in time. And so it took me up to the chief's quarters, and it went, down a ladder, and the ladder was pretty much straight up and down. Went down to the chief's quarters, and they had a canvas curtain there, and you had to knock on the curtain, ask permission to come in. And my chief was sitting there at the table. They had a mess table there for about 8 guys. And he's sitting there in his underwear drinking a beer, and this was about 10 o'clock in the morning. And he said, okay, I'm Fletcher, I'm new aboard. He said, you want a beer? I said, well, it's a little early. He said, do you smoke? I said, no. Do you cuss? Well, I have to. He said, you got any fucking tattoos? And I said, no. And he goes, you're not a fucking bosun mate, get out of here. So I went back up the ladder. It's just kind of like, whoa, that was an interesting meeting. And about 15 minutes later, they piped me back down to chief quarters again, and I went back down there, and he said, I want you to go out and I want you to make me a diagram of the magazine sprinkling system and the fire mains. And I thought, well, I remember reading something about it in the book, but I certainly didn't know where they were. So I came out of there and I'm kind of walking down this passageway, and it went down and it turned and it straightened out again. And I'm walking toward the damage control shop, and there on the wall is that schematic of all those systems. And I'm just staring at it, kind of walking toward the light. And there was a DC in there. And I said, is that the schematics for the ship? And he goes, oh yeah, this green, and that's the magazine sprinkling system, and the red is the fire mains. And I'm like, holy cow. And I just started tracing everything off on a sheet of paper. And he said, well, I better go find these. I know where they are. And it told what compartments you were in and what deck level and everything else. So I said, I better go find all these. So I went and I just, okay, there it is. Here it goes. It goes down here. And came back and I gave it to the chief probably an hour later. I said, here's your diagram. And he looked at it and he just wadded it up and threw it away. And there was one of the valves for the fire main isolation valves right over his head. And I'd come down and looked at that earlier, and he just threw it away. And that was my introduction to the chief. So. But anyway, when we were out in Vietnam, here was one of the supply ships, and this one was, I think, mainly just groceries. And I can't remember the name of this, but we got food sometimes with a vert trip, and it was vertical replenishment. And they had a big, is that a Chinook? Does anybody know? Is that a Chinook helicopter, two-bladed thing? Yep. Anyway, they'd pick up a great big cargo net full of groceries, bring it over, and the cutter was so small that they'd have to come in sideways and then drop this thing on the deck, and then we'd have about 60 guys there that would just grab it and run to get it out of the way, because they'd be coming back here in a couple minutes and bring everything up to the bow and stack everything up. But anyway, that's how we got groceries for the most part. And you can see them coming in here and getting ready to. Did
you have the capability for alongside replenishment?
We did. And about every 3 days then, oh, there's our bosun mate guys, 2 third class and myself. It's gone Liberty. It's in here somewhere. I'll find it. We got some unwrap or some replenishment stuff. So about every 3 days we would replenish with that. This was us in Subic Bay. And how many of you guys are Navy? Okay. Do you know what a YOS is?
I've been Subic, it better not have some of that.
A YOS is a fuel barge.
Oh, yeah.
Who knows what a YG is? That's a garbage barge. And a YSR, sludge removal barge. And a YPD, that's a pile driving barge. All right? They used us to keep those things from banging into the gray ones. Okay? They didn't care if the white ones turned brown and gray. They didn't want the gray ones turning brown and gray, all right? So we were a fender. And you guys know what a fender is. It's to keep something from banging into something else, all right? So we were a fender for the Navy. And if another destroyer came in, they would pull us out, put the destroyer in there, bring us back in, so we were on the outside. So every time the garbage barge came alongside us, and these guys needed dump garbage, what'd they do? They walked it all the way across, stood on the Coast Guard cutter, threw it in the garbage barge, and then walked all the way back over. So that was our job in Subic. And believe me, after the first time we were there, the captain says we're not going back. And he didn't. We were tied alongside the Samuel Gompers, I think was the name of it. It was a destroyer tender. And those guys could make anything. I mean, hats off to those tenders, because they could do anything. We were out one time, and this is the small boat ready to be lowered. So there's called a strongback on the far side of that, and they'd suck the boat up onto that strongback so it wouldn't wiggle around or do anything like that. That strongback was basically a telephone pole, and then it had some great big balsa wood fenders on it that were covered with leather. And we were out in this big storm, and there was so much movement back and forth and rocking back and forth that we actually broke that strongback. And like I say, it was a telephone pole and probably 30 feet long. So we came back. That was our trip back to the Gompers, and they had a lathe, and they made one. And I don't know where they cut the tree down, but anyway, they hauled it up there, and they put it on a lathe, and they made us another strongback for that small boat. And I think as soon as we got it up there and tightened everything up, we left.
That was a 30-foot?
26-foot small boat. Yeah, so the thing was probably 30 feet long overall.
In a lathe?
In a lathe. Yeah.
So that picture is rather interesting because you have three different classes of destroyer. 135 is a destroyer escort, 684 is a Fletcher class destroyer, and 948 is a destroyer leader.
There you go. And next to that is the Gompers, and that, what's a destroyer leader? What, probably around close to 400 feet?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Because I know that the 135 there was, I think was 308. Because they were longer than we were, and they couldn't believe it. But we had a 34-foot beam, and I think those guys were about 28 or something like that. So 29? Pretty close.
They also had a 1,200-pound plant instead of a 600-pound plant, which was kind of dangerous at times.
For steam?
Steam pressure.
Okay. Well, if you wanted to complicate the machinery system, you could get on that 255 because they burned oil and made steam, took the steam and spun a generator, then drove a DC motor, single screw, and it was a very complicated system, but I think it was highly efficient. What they couldn't make was fresh water. Well, they could, but they couldn't do it on a regular basis. Okay, so we talked a little bit about going to Subic Bay, and we went on R&R several places. So we go on patrol, which was about 7 weeks long, and then we went to Kaohsiung, Formosa. We went to Hong Kong. We went to Singapore. When we were way down here on the south, Singapore was just another little trip over here a little ways. So we got to some places that the Navy couldn't get to just because of our size. And unfortunately, when we were in Hong Kong, the ship that was going to come in for station ship broke down, and they asked us to stay for station ship, which was the same as a patrol, was 7 more weeks in Hong Kong. And then we got to go to Hong Kong for R&R after our 7-week patrol there. And well, we ran the shore patrol. And my job as a bosun mate was to run people who wanted to go ashore, the officers, run them back and forth to the pier. So I had 1 day of running the boat back and forth into Hong Kong. Next day I got on the first boat and went to Hong Kong, came back on the last boat. Next day ran the boat again. So that was my time in Hong Kong. Neat place. If I ever could go back again, I think Hong Kong would be a neat place to go back to. Who in here's in the Army? Was in the Army. Okay. Coast Guard worked for the Army, and they worked in explosive loading and port security. And the Army had hired Vietnamese stevedores, or whatever you want to call them, to help unload ammunition. And it wasn't working very well. The Vietnamese didn't have a very good safety record or a work ethic, and they didn't have any real explosions, but they had a lot of problems. And so they asked the Coast Guard to come in. I don't think the Army asked the Coast Guard to come in. Somebody did. And the Army wasn't very happy about it, but then after they kind of implemented some safety procedures and stuff, the Army was pretty happy to have them over there doing that. Coast Guard's famous for stealing stuff, especially from the Navy, because we didn't have any money and we didn't have any way to get stuff, so we pretty much stole everything. And they were unloading ammunition in Cameron Bay, and they said they needed some little electric forklifts, and the Army couldn't get them. Well, the Coast Guard found 37 of them in storage in Cameron Bay, and they ended up using them, and they'd come over with the ship and drop, or a barge, and they'd drop the electric forklift down in the hold, and they used that then to move ammunition over where they could hoist it out. And after that, then the Army said, you guys are pretty cool. Air Force people.
Air Force?
Okay, we got a couple Air Force, good. All right, Coast Guard worked with the Air Force. The Coast Guard and the Air Force made a joint agreement with pilots so that the Coast Guard guys would go train with Air Force pilots doing rescue with the Jolly Green Giants. And then the Coast Guard would train Air Force pilots on what they did with their helicopters for search and rescue. So they had a joint training program together, and the Coast Guard flew a lot of missions in pilot recovery missions over there in Vietnam. So there was a lot of Coast Guard pilots flying Air Force helicopters there. The other thing that they did was the Air Force was having trouble locating and pinpointing targets, especially up in this northern area. And later on in the war, they needed some more, like we'd use a GPS now. They needed better ability to locate where they were and where they were going. So the Coast Guard had a called a LORAN system, long range aids navigation, and it was a radio signal that went out. It had a master station and a slave station. Towers were almost 700 feet tall, and they would use those to pinpoint locations like a GPS would. And so they decided they needed this for coverage over the northern part of Vietnam, so they decided to put in two master slave stations, so a total of 4 towers. So they went over there and they decided that Vietnam wasn't really a good place to put them because they didn't think they could defend them. So they actually went into Cambodia and set those up, and they were going to have the headquarters in Da Nang, and they felt like that wasn't safe enough either. So they went over there and they told them they would have these stations set up in 7 months. And they didn't have land, they didn't have anything over there yet. They got them set up in 4 months, built and online so that the pilots could use those then to go ahead and do bombing and stuff. And there was a funny story about the guy that they sent over. They sent over a lieutenant commander and a warrant officer, and warrants kind of have a reputation of getting stuff done. And these 2 guys went over there and they started talking to the Cambodians. They were trying to find an office to run this thing out of and coordinate the construction and all the shipping and all that stuff over there. And Cambodia wasn't very happy because the Americans would promise them money for whatever they were doing, and they weren't very good at paying. So they were complaining about that, and they tried to get office space in Bangkok, and there was no office space available just because, you were Americans, we don't have any office space. So the commander sent the warrant over there, and he says, go find something. Went and was talking to this guy, and this other guy knew somebody who knew somebody, and they just built this 7-story office building, and it was just completed. And so the warrant ended up talking to this guy that had the building, and he said, we don't have anything because you guys don't pay. And he says, I've got cash. I've got a cashier's check for $25,000. If you can cash the check, we'll pay you a year rent in advance. And so the guy ended up going to the bank, getting the check cashed, came back the next day and they're arguing with the Air Force and the Navy about what they can do and how long it's going to take to do all this stuff. And the warrant says, here's the office address and the phone number. And they went like, holy cow, you guys are going to get it done. And so they did. They got it handled, and they got it up there in about half the time.
So is that where one of the towers was on that building?
No,
That was just
kind of the office to run stuff out
that
of.
was in Thailand, right? You said Bangkok, did you?
Yeah, in Thailand, yeah, yeah. So let's see what else we got on here. We got more pictures. All right. They're in relationship, and I don't know what that oiler is, but I think that's the America, and probably an oiler like the Pacific or something like that, and one of the cutters like I was on. And anytime we had to do underway replenishment, we'd have to call them on the radio and tell them, you got to slow down to 16 knots. And they were like, oh, really? Okay, because they wanted to refuel and stuff at about 22. We didn't do 22 even going downhill. It wouldn't work. All right. So that's just a relationship picture of what the Coast Guard was compared to some of the other stuff that was out there. Trying to keep up. Yeah, we were going as fast as we could there. All right. Here's a replenishment, and we'd run along side by side of a supply ship or an oiler or something. And this is, we got a chaplain for about a week. And this is the chaplain coming over. And he's halfway over. I think he did this a lot, but most of the people that did this has just scared the crap out of him.
If you were
looking at
popular with the crew, you got a little dunking.
Yeah. Yeah, if it was the old man, he would probably be wet up to the waist going over and coming back. All right. So this was alongside one of the Navy oilers. We'd get fuel forward, we'd get ammunition and any kind of stores and a Christmas tree, whatever they wanted to send over. Movies, they'd have a list up there on the bridge of the movies that they had on board, and you could just kind of order off the menu which movies you wanted, and then you'd send movies back, and these are, big rolls of film. But that was an underway replenishment. Here's the fuel coming over. It was pretty rough in between the ships.
Looks like it.
You're about 100 feet apart. Very careful steering. Here we are getting mail and whatever. This is aft. So this was the stores. They'd come over and set things down on the deck, and people would run and grab them and take off. Most of the time I was in the ready boat. So they were ready to lower me away if somebody fell overboard. They'd just drop me in the water, and we'd go get them. And one day they lost a bag of mail off of this thing because things were bouncing and swinging and everything. So they lost a bag of mail, so they threw me in the water, and I went back and got the mail. And I think the ship was doing 16, and I think the small boat was doing 13. And they went over the horizon, and we're out there in the middle of the South China Sea going, I don't think they went that way. I'm not sure. This is one of the Navy patrol boats, or a gunboat, I guess you guys call it, that they were brand new, and they sent them over there to help out. I think they were like 110 or 20, 125 maybe, feet long. This was our main duty. Here's one of the swift boats coming alongside. We were mothership to all the swift boats in an area. We were the mothership for them, and we provide them ammunition. We had a public health service doctor on board, ice cream, so they like to come out and see us. Like I say, these guys were usually eating. They come up and get something to eat. And we fed a lot of them. So there's 5 of them alongside. And then here's a group. I think we had about 30 that night that got together, and we provided gunfire support. They'd go up a river and piss everybody off, and then they'd try to catch them coming out. So we'd let them go up the river, and then when they started coming back, we'd shoot along the shoreline. And try to keep everybody from sleeping. I think that was the most part. Sometimes they go out there and they say, we're going to do an H&I was harassment and indignation. And you'd go out somewhere and just shoot one round. And we could, the 5-inch gun I think goes about 6 or 7 miles. And they just fire one round. Everybody go back to bed. One of the twin 50s on top of the swiftboats. They're coming back after a gunfight. You can see all the brass in the stern there. A lot of stuff going on. You can see the blood in the coxswain flat here running down the deck. This is one of the guys, and they actually came out with a helicopter and hovered right off the bow of the ship, and we loaded this guy into the helicopter, Red Cross helicopter. What the hell? It was an Army helicopter with a big Red Cross on it. How about that? And they shot him off the bow of the ship into this helicopter as he was hovering, and off they went. That's the guy right there. He's coming in. Okay, so anyway, that's me. Some numbers. We fired 3,110 rounds of 5-inch over there with the same barrel. We didn't rebarrel at all, but over 3,000 rounds of 5-inch. They say we hit 43 bunkers, 209 structures, 42 sampans, had 7 secondary explosions, and 13 sustained fires. I don't know. That's what they say we did anyway. And we had 50 missions that we ran with swiftboats. Go ahead.
What was the range of a 5-inch gun?
6 or 7 miles, probably 6 miles. And we inspected 541 junks. We had Liberty at Subi Point Naval Air Station. Was that right? Am I pronouncing that right?
In the Philippines?
In the Philippines? Kubi Point? Kubi Point. We got invited up there for a party one day. And how many Marines we have in here? All right. So before I get started, thank you guys. Because we went up to this party and we were wearing those stupid Donald Duck looking hats. And that's the only way, that and the acorn on your sleeve was the only way you could tell Coasties apart from the Navy guys. And we were up at this big EM club. It was a beautiful place, it really was. Just a sea of white hats in there, and everybody was wearing white uniforms. I don't know how it happened. Something's got started. And the fight was on. And there was not a brown shirt in that place. I guarantee it. It was all white. And I don't know if you guys were under the tables or you were just morphed into from some. Anyway, you'd have some guy from the Navy and you'd be punching him, and there'd be a Marine come up and tap you on the shoulder and go, "Let me do this." And he just kind of push you aside and grab the Navy guy and just start pounding on him. And I don't know where all the Marines came from. There was a Marine for every Navy guy in there. Anyway, thank you guys.
So that fight was between the Coasties and the Navy?
Well, I think that's how it started, but then it morphed into the Marines and the Navy real quick. We did a lot of medical visits to villages because we had a public health service doctor on board, and we were always close enough to the beach that we could pretty much see people walking around there. And so we went to Vung Tau, which is
Right, further south.
In the middle, right?
There you go.
there, Vung Tau. Beautiful, beautiful place. If you ever get a chance to go to Vietnam and look at it, Vung Tau was like the French Riviera of Vietnam. We were down at Ha Tan, and An Toi was at the island right across from it. All right. Phan Rang, Cam Ranh Bay, Nha Trang. We didn't do a lot of going on the beach up above. I got to spend 6 weeks in the Navy hospital getting my appendix out, and they tried to kill me, but that was the only battle that I had was with the Navy. But those were some of the cities that we went into and did medical visits and dental work and vaccinations and that kind of stuff. We helped them repair some generators and some other things that went on board. So to kind of finish up, 9 of the Coast Guard had a bunch of 95-foot patrol boats that were made in the early 50s, and they sent those over and gave them to South Korea. And South Korea was also involved in helping the United States during the Vietnam War. And the South Koreans put more guns on that boat than it should have sunk them. But they painted them a dark gray, and they just had them covered with 50 caliber machine guns, and you name it. It would still float, they'd put another gun on it. They were nuts. So all 9 of the 95 boats went to South Korea in 1968. Most of the 311-foot Old Navy seaplane tenders went to Vietnam, and they turned them over to the Vietnamese Navy prior to disbanding the Squadron 3 in 1971. And of those 311s that the Navy had, I think there was probably 11 or 12 of them. The Navy used a couple for targets after when they were decommissioning them. A couple were sunk as reefs. They transferred 5 of them to the Vietnamese Navy, and the transfer didn't go very well. If they could find an excuse to stay tied up, they did. And the Navy and the Coast Guard weren't very happy with that part of it. When Vietnam fell or surrendered, 4 of those 5 went to the Philippines, and one of them was captured by the North Vietnamese Navy and was used until the 1990s. So that had a nice longevity. Those ships were commissioned right after World War II, like 1945, 46. So it had a nice longevity, but it was in the North Vietnamese Navy. Of all the 82-foot boats that went over there, 26 of them, the Coast Guard gave all of those to the Vietnamese Navy, and those were turned over in incremental things where they put part of the crew on, and then another few people came on. They were having trouble getting people to join the Navy, and they didn't want to get those boats underway either. They find something that they could say was wrong with them and keep them tied up. They did, but all those boats went there and were transferred to South Vietnam. And the last Coast Guard guy was one of them that was working on the Loran stations. And when the day before the surrender, the Coast Guard destroyed the generators and everything for those Loran stations. The towers remained intact, but all the infrastructure and everything else for them, they destroyed it. And the last Coastie left Vietnam on the 5th of May, 1973. That was it. Any questions? Yes?
I wonder if some of these boats we gave to them ended up helping Vietnamese people escape from Vietnam. Do you have any information?
I don't know that answer. Yeah, if you look at Shen's history of the Coast Guard boats, it just says when they get down to that, it says it was transferred and the disposition was unknown. So I really don't know. Most of those 82-footers, from what I've read, were so poorly maintained, they probably couldn't get to the Philippines. They had to refuel them anyway between the Philippines and there, so I doubt it. Yes?
So Tom, I came today not to bury the Coast Guard, but to praise you.
Ah,
When I got to my swiftboat assignment, first was 38 boat and later the 95 boat at Catlow, at the edge of the Rungsat Special Zone. I worked with the WPB guys, I think they were 82 footers. They had one officer, they had 11 men, they had a self-righting hull, which really impressed me because we lost 6 Swifts in weather during the Vietnam War. As I understand it, there were 15 trawlers that we captured or destroyed, and in the original pictures, if you look, there's a cutter present in the kill. So I learned a lot from the Coast Guard. I went to school on those guys about how you move from being a deep water sailor into a muddy water sailor, and how you can go between the two and still be competent. So I just wanted to be here. Hey, I'm Steve Barta, Coast Guard Reserve. He's the guy that got me back into thinking about the military stuff after 50 years. So I came to not only praise you, but him and everybody in the Coast Guard, especially the guys that I served with and taught me so much in Vietnam.
well, thank you, and Captain Barta's here. And thank you. Captain Barta was my commanding officer in Reserve Unit Denver here too, so.
Captain Barta, would you stand up for a minute? All right, guys, give a hand for the Coast Guard, of course.
All right.
And anybody else that served in the Coast Guard as well. But, yeah, I do want to give you a special.
I hope there's a Marine here.
We got time for a couple more questions. Any other questions for Tom back there?
Good question here about as Vietnam evolved over time. Was this a new mission for the Coast Guard? Is it something the Coast Guard had done previously, or was this
Not,
added on to services? And then obviously you probably had to get trained for this involvement, and it seems like you adapted pretty well.
yeah, not really. We did a lot of, not really fisheries patrol. I mean, I'm thinking about my experience on the Oregon coast. We had a lot of Russian trawlers and factory canning ships that were coming by there in the mid-60s. We were enforcing the 3-mile limit. We also were helping, we had a couple instances where somebody on the trawler had an appendicitis and the Coast Guard flew out and got him, took him to the hospital, and then a few weeks later we took him back on a lifeboat and took him back to the ship. So really not much different than what we've been doing. I mean, tying in the aids to navigation and the setting the buoys in the rivers and all that stuff, to the Loran, to explosive loading. Those are all things we did here. We just did them in a little more humid and heated environment.
Search and rescue?
Yep.
You had a lot of assets over there. Did that impact the mission at home of the Coast Guard?
Probably to a certain extent. I don't know if I could say how much that impacted. When the weather cutters, we call them weather cutters, right? They would go out, and one of our jobs was to go out between San Francisco and Hawaii and basically direct traffic. And airplanes would use us for a lighthouse, and fly over us and then go on to Hawaii. So they had a place to aim. That was going on. That was one of the things we were involved in. But with this Loran, long range aids to navigation, all that changed all that. Planes changed from prop to jet, and they didn't really have the mechanical issues that they would have had. More reliability. We're going a little faster. And it got so they didn't need those weather stations. There was, on the East Coast, there must have been 6 or 7 of those weather stations. There were, 5 in the late 40s out on the West Coast. And when I got in the Coast Guard, there was only 2, and that was the one between Frisco and Hawaii. And then there was one out there between Guam and Yokosuka. So there was only those 2. And they discontinued those a couple years later just because of the changes in aviation and the changes in navigation.
Tom,
Yes, sir.
was a lot of brown water Navy boats over there. Is the PBR the only one you serviced?
Yeah, because the river boats, what were those, the PBRs? Little,
All three of the
Tango
waves.
boats, the Mike boats, command boats, different boats.
the swift boats were the only ones I think that felt really comfortable getting out of the river and going a little further out into the Gulf. We never did have any Mike boats come alongside, or they were mostly river, right?
So there were 3 waves of intervention. Task forces 115, 116, 117. 116 had game warden, that was the PBRs. They stayed in the rivers because they could go 30 knots and turn within the length of the boat, and they only drew about 4 to 6 inches of water, which is extraordinary as you think about it. The Delta, which you guys couldn't get into, you could go aground with a 4-foot draft swift boat about 10 or 12 miles out of the sea when the tide went out. It was a 10 to 12 daily, twice daily tidal sweep. So the Navy had to learn every stage of the way, and Zumwalt got us entirely off the coast. We had shifted at everything. 95% was coming in from the coast until market time, which was Coast Guard and the US Navy. It all went to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. 100 pounds could still come down the back of a guy on a bicycle, but it cost him a lot more. Then we had to get into the rivers because we knew that the waterborne resupply was intense. The river patrol boats came in, game warden. I trained them for a year and a half at the end. Then we had the riverine assault forces. That was Army, monitors, troops going through the Delta. It's a long story, it's an interesting story, but there's a lot to it. Every boat was different.
But pretty,
Brown water Navy? You were in the brown water Navy?
Well, I was in early incursions up the rivers, which I hated,
Okay.
because we had, two of my boats, the 2 of the boats in my unit, the year before I got there and the year while I was there, was sunk with 1 shot, either a rocket-propelled grenade or a 75 millimeter recoilless, which would put a 4-foot hole in a swift boat. So I hated to go up there. It was close. The canal, some of them were about twice as wide as this room. The rocket-propelled grenade 7 could be effective at 7.5 football lengths. It would penetrate 12 inches of homogeneous steel. You didn't want to go in the rivers if you could avoid it, and you hoped that it would go through the aluminum and not hit anything really solid. But the coast we shut down successfully within about a year and a half. The rivers, we had to bring in not only the patrol boats, but then we had to bring in the river assault, and that's where the SEALs became the SEALs. That was their nursery. And today, we have a successor, MS Squadron 1, which provides small boat support all over the planet for SEALs under all conditions. So that was an important moment in American naval history when we became fluid enough to go from deep water into muddy water and back again and handle all the intermediate terrain. We did hand over to the Army training in river patrol boats so you could take over security for what became Ho Chi Minh City.
It's still Saigon, as far as I know.
that's what he meant, Saigon, all right.
It's still the Saigon River.
Lou?
There is a flip chart in the Vietnam room of most of the boats that we had out there. And you can see one of them's got a good explanation why it's Brown Water Navy.
And I forgot to hang this up. This was one of the posters that we would take out, and we had a whole bunch of little leaflets we'd pass out when we went into the villages, and they were, some of these pictures were on them, and a lot of the things they were trying to get people to turn in or to surrender. If you brought in, and there's one of them that's, well, it's back here, and I just donated here a little while ago. There's a list of things. If you brought in a rifle that was, what, a .762 or whatever, you could get so many, what was the Vietnam? Piastres. All right, they pay you so much money to bring in a weapon. And the bigger the weapon, it got in down at the bottom. You can't read any of it. It's like this. You get down to the bottom, and it says bazooka, and it was like 60,000 piastres. But you could read bazooka. That's the only English word that's on there. But they were trying to get you to go ahead and turn stuff in and help them out. But anyway, this is one of the posters that I found, and it was funny. I found this thing. I'd sent stuff to my parents, and my mom saved all the letters, and a few years ago she gave me a whole package and said, here's all the letters you sent from Vietnam. And I was looking through it, God, 20 years later, and folded up in those letters, I had sent this home. So this hadn't, that was one of our big posters that they were putting up in the villages. Okay, so these are your boats.
Any other questions for Tom?
Well, I want to thank Tom for coming. I thought this was a great talk. Again, I learned a lot about Coast Guard, what you guys were actually doing out there in Vietnam. I know they were lifesavers. I might have mentioned earlier that I went to a joint service school, and Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, we got along, like that. But the Coast Guard, they were always the easiest going guys. We really enjoyed working with them. Anyway, thank you, Tom. I got a coin here, an appreciation from the museum. And I definitely want to remind you all that we do have the movie, The Finest Hours. What we're going to do is take a break. We have hot dogs outside, so if you'd like a little lunch in the library, you can go ahead and stop through. You can even bring the hot dog back here for the movie while we get the movie set up. You're going to stick around for the movie. We'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you.